this video, I'm going to briefly demonstrate some basics to sanding your wooden ticket. It's critical though that you first complete the entire sanding module. From the presentation, you will learn about grit number, the different sanding machines, and the proper sanding schedule to follow for surfaces, edges, and ends. There's also a couple of videos to address good sanding practices, as well as some sanding concepts to remember. This video will reinforce the concepts from the sanding module. Like most projects, there are three main parts to sanding the ticket. These are the ends, the edges, and the surfaces. I'd recommend sanding them in that order. To sand the curved and angled end grain, you'll find it helpful to secure your ticket in a table vise. This allows you to use both hands, and it keeps your ticket from moving as you sand. You'll spend most of your time on this step because cutting the wood fibers is more difficult on the end grain. Use 80 grit to remove burns and chipping, then use 120 to remove the 80 grit scratches, and then finally 180 to remove the 120 grit scratches. For the angles, you should use a sanding block with the sandpaper wrapped around it. Keep the block flat on the angle that you're sanding. On that small surface, you want to be careful that you're keeping it nice and flat, not rounding off and changing the shape. For the curve, you'll do the sanding by hand alone, which will likely cause the chamfer eventually to round over. This is not ideal, but in order to remove the scratches in this practice exercise, it's okay if it happens. To sand the edges, you'll want to place the ticket on a sanding mat to avoid scratching the back surface. Use 120 grit wrapped around a sanding block to remove any defects from the edge. 120 grit should be all you need, unless your species is a softwood. Then you'll want to use 180 grit as well. To sand the surfaces, again, use a mat. Normally, on surfaces, I use a handheld power sander, like this orbital sander, but the ticket is small enough that you might as well just hand sand. Since you've already drum sanded your surfaces, go straight to 120 grit on a sanding block. If your grain pattern is not straight, or if your species is a softwood, then you'll likely have to proceed to 180 grit as well, but most people, 120 grit will be enough. So having worked through sanding your ends, edges, and surfaces, your ticket will now be ready for finish. But I'd recommend that you have me take a look first. I'll be able to point out any scratches that you may have missed.